This is Ken Beers with Boxford Life Sciences, providing an introduction to Python pharmaceutical forecasting, software for the economic analysis of drug development, commercialization, and deals. The goal of this software is to accelerate and improve decisions in pharmaceutical development, commercialization, and transactions by automating economic analyses from natural descriptions of market dynamics, clinical programs, commercial activities, and licensing and M&A deals. PPFC has four main modules that we can pull into a problem depending upon needs. In development and market evolution, we model the sequencing, duration, cost, and success probability of clinical trials and regulatory reviews, and link these to decision variables about which development pathways and lifecycle management options to pursue. We can also describe the uncertain future evolution of markets, such as launches of competitors. In forecasting and valuation, we describe market dynamics across multiple diseases, multiple geographies, and clinical segments that are conditional upon development and market evolution. Software then automatically builds and executes models to forecast and value drugs or portfolios of drugs. In clinical trial simulation, we can introduce models of clinical trials that can introduce models of recruitment time versus number of patients, budgets for how the cost depends upon the design of the trial, and even go to the level of translating individual expected patient clinical responses to sets of clinical outcomes data, and then link those clinical outcomes to the forecast and valuation models that we developed in our descriptions of the clinical development pathway. And in deal design and evolution, we can describe the terms of licensing or M&A deals and link these to the asset models so that we can evaluate and optimize the economics of those deals for that asset over development and market uncertainty. The key point of differentiation on PPFC is that we don't build the models manually. Instead, we describe the market dynamics, and then the software automatically builds and launches these models for us. The process to define market dynamics is a very natural one, following the typical kind of thinking and market research that goes into these economic analyses. First, we define a development path of clinical trials and regulatory reviews whose success or failure governs the sales of the asset. Next, we set epidemiology, either prevalence or incidence of patients by disease and segment of disease, which could be defined by geography or by clinical subgroup. We then move patients across a treatment journey that's described via flows and stocks, where stocks are individual states in the disease and flows are movements of patients from one state to the next. These flow dynamics can vary with calendar time, or they can vary with the time since a patient has entered a stock that we see often in oncology models where we have finite courses of therapy and resolution and response to therapy that evolves over time. We can adjust these stock and flow assumptions that are typically set first on the basis of preference shares for the effects of market access by payer and for promotional reach to reflect the kind of commercial investments that we make to support the product through marketing and sales. And then we can map the patient populations in each stock to the volumes of drugs that are consumed and then the resulting gross and net revenues. We then integrate these cells with the development and commercial costs that we calculate for a complete profit and loss statement of the asset and to compute expected net present value. To accomplish these tasks, PPFC offers a wide suite of tools to rapidly define and deploy models. The core and what users particularly interact with are functionality to describe market dynamics. We have low-level specifications. We can combine them into higher-level templates that implement an entire task in a forecast model, and then pull those templates together into example models that can be rapidly redeployed for different problems just by editing the inputs. Those descriptions of market dynamics that are built by PPFC then are passed on to other objects and classes within PPFC that collect all the information around an asset model, generate the model itself automatically, and then wrapping it around with functionality in order to manage different forecast case and add scripts to add additional functionality that could be drawn from built-in libraries or provided by users. These models then can be launched via an automatically generated graphical user interface that provides a very consistent look and feel across different models via traditional windows like pull-down menus. And as needed, we can integrate additional components for clinical trial simulations or deal simulation and economic analysis to the models that we create. And so we have a package here that combines both the opportunity for non-technical users to run PPFC, generate simple models, run models that other people have developed via very traditional graphical user interface look and feel, but then analysts can also use some of these lower levels, more detailed tools to create and run bespoke scripts to do exactly the kinds of analyses that they want and integrate the results across many different models, different assets to provide franchise and enterprise-wide views. To see how this descriptive approach differs from the traditional build model in Excel approach, let's consider a task where modeling a brand share that grows to a peak of 50% by 7 years after launch. And then after 10 years of market exclusivity, the share declines back to 0 over 2 years. We see here a typical kind of table that we would make in Excel, where we have some input cells that we can modify. We have a number of calculation cells that we protect so that users can't go in and change the formulas. But the calculations are done by repeated sets of formulas that can be quite complicated and need to use dollar signs in particular spots as we copy across to keep certain inputs consistent as we change the row or column. Now, the challenge with this approach is a single missing dollar sign can cause the model to crash, or even worse, to create a subtle error so that the results are wrong, but it's not immediately apparent. These are rigid but brittle designs. We need to do cell protection for safety, and when we have to go in and modify the logic, that typically calls for major surgery where we have to go in, make changes, stitch everything together, re-protect it, and it can be time-consuming. There's also a wasted effort to rebuild the same table logic many times. Often in the same model, we might repeat this many different times, just in a different context for different brands or different segments in the larger model. And finally, our markets that we simulate are very uncertain. And to do that via scenarios and Monte Carlo analysis requires additional layers of logic or add-on tools that, again, make these models more tedious to build and potentially prone to error. By contrast, if we take this modular descriptive approach that PPFC uses, we can generate that same logic just through a simple command, or as we'll see in a moment, through a graphical user interface template. What we do is we use a template, which are elements that provide model specifications, in this case for this logic about how a preference share grows to a peak over time. Our templates define where in the model these assumptions are to be used. In this case, it's in a disease named chronic for flow 1L for first line allocation when we're allocating patients to a sync product X for this particular drug. We also easily link realizing non-zero peak share upon development success, in this case that we successfully reach a development state called approval, that is success of the regulatory review. We can set different peak shares by segment. In this case, we have only the US. We can set uptake as a function of time since launch. In this case, we have a simple linear schedule growing to 100% uptake by 7 years, but we can have much more complicated uptake schedules and pull those in from libraries based on things like analogs as needed. We define a market exclusivity, which is the ladder of data exclusivity expiration and expiration of patent protection that occurs at a date that we specify. And then after loss of exclusivity, we give it a similar schedule to uptake that describes how the share then returns back to 0 as we have competition with generics or biosimilars. Now this template we input just by giving the inputs, but hidden within it is a lot of the logic that provides and describes to PPFC how it's supposed to implement the model. And that's done by methods called build model methods of these templates that output a set of instructions to PPFC that's written in text as a list of a bunch of different dictionaries that provide instructions to the software on how to implement the dynamics in a template. And what PPFC does is it has a collection of templates that collectively describe the market dynamics. It pulls it all together, checks to make sure everything's consistent, and that we've provided all the information we need. If there's gaps, if there's inconsistencies, it'll do an error message. But if not, then it assembles the method overall, has the different templates that work together through their syntax in order to create the model. Now, there's not a lot that we need to understand about this syntax. We can read it. It's pretty self-explanatory, but there's just a few points to cover here in general just to understand how this works. The first is each one of these different blocks of the syntax, which is a dictionary, has a key that says what kind of information it's created. Here we have a static variable that stores a single value that may change over segments, but it doesn't change with time. We also are defining here dates, which are calendar dates in month-year format, curves, like an uptake curve that describes how an entity changes in some other event, and time variables that describe how some entity changes over calendar time. For example, we could combine an uptake curve along with the date of launch and get uptake as a function of calendar time. These individual parts of the syntax also then have some scoping elements that say where are these assumptions to be applied. Here we have assumptions that are defined for specific diseases and segments. And finally, we have the properties that are applied. In this case, it's a static variable, so we give it the name that we want to apply to it, the value, the type that it holds. We can have some additional minimum and maximum values, and we can provide descriptions and notes that are references on what the static variable is supposed to represent and how was it created. As I said, the syntax provides ultimately the descriptions to PPFC on how to operate, but we don't write that ourselves. If we need to generate these, we use routines that are within the module PPFC specs that return those. But more commonly, how we interact with PPFC is through templates, which collect a number of these different specifications into a single group so that they work in concert to execute a task. PPFC templates is a built-in library of these templates, but we can also write our own as long as we mirror the basic structure of a template that we see here. These templates are Python classes that inherit from a package called Pydantic, the base model functionality that allows you to do type checking on inputs, so that as we provide inputs, in addition to giving defaults, we can say what type of values do they need to be and what are the limits in terms of potentially upper bounds or lower bounds that we want to apply. We provide generally a tag, which is going to be a unique name to this template so that the variable that it creates are distinguished from all the other variables that are created by potentially the same type of template, but just in different parts of the model. We describe scope where these assumptions are to be defined. Here by diseases and segments. By default, it applies to all segments and diseases across the model. And then we provide the information that we want to specify that drive how this template is supposed to operate. In this case, just for simplicity, we have a single share, which is going to be a number that needs to be between 0 and 100%. Now the key functionality of every template is this build model routine that takes two pieces of information, a set of global parameters that define the high-level structure of the model with diseases, drugs, segments, payers that we're modeling, and a development path which has all the different stages and states of clinical development and market evolution. And since both those pieces of information are often required by templates in order to do their job, we always pass them so that they're available. What this build model does is return a set of specifications, in this case for a definition of a single static variable that's going to be the name of a share. And we do that by calling individual calls to PPFC specs. So that gives us a very low-level control over the dynamics. In addition to these low-level specifications, we could within a template call other templates, and so make these hierarchical, again, to work together in a very well-defined way. In this case, this single call to create a static variable creates just this return of language that you see here, which again is the syntax that goes to PPFC to describe how to implement this template. And finally, for convenience, we often add get label routines that return the name of the variables that the template creates. And so by doing this, when we merge templates together, we can have the different templates see what names are used by other ones in order to work together. And again, it's a way to help make these things work together in a very coordinated, well-controlled manner. Now, these templates are key. We can largely create most of the models we need using just built-in templates. There's a wide variety that are available. And each one of those built-in templates also has a graphical user interface that allows users to populate or edit them without having to do any Python scripting. When we have templates that users can provide, they can define their own graphical user interfaces that are attached using a lot of the tools within the PPFC GUI module to handle most of the effort. And the way it's done is that those windows then end up looking very similar in look and feel to the ones that are built into the model. If you don't have that time and you just want to create a user-defined template and not worry about the GUI, PPFC will open a functional default generic editor that allows users to still go in and effectively change the inputs just without all the polish that you see when you do a bespoke interface for it. Here we see the graphical user interface for this dynamic share allocation, where we can go into the different fields in here, change peak shares, change the conditionality on whether the drug is approved or not, and go in and do local overrides of assumptions by segment. In these different inputs, we can also scroll down in Windows to view all the different value and data that's stored in a template. Individual elements and buttons in here that's specific to the template also allows you to go in and do specific tasks. In this case, we could go in and edit the uptake schedule. If we didn't want to have 0 to 100% over 7 years, we could go in and make those individual edits to here as we needed. And then for each one of these templates, if you want to go in and see exactly what the template is telling PPFC to do, you can view the syntax and you can see how the inputs that you've provided end up mapping to a set of instructions to build the model. Part of the power of this template approach is that you can make these templates be hierarchical to allow clusters of specifications to be defined that work in concert to handle a very large level of the tasks and very quickly launch these, populate them quickly, and have a very fast model building process. Here we see an example of a template that handles all preference share allocations in a disease. And we start at left with a template called flow structure that handles the patient journey for a disease. Here it's for a chronic disease, describing patient movement from prevalence through diagnosis, treatment, first line allocation, failure on first line, and second line allocation. Each one of those flows then, you can drill into it and open up a flow allocation template that handles the preference share allocations for that flow. Here we see the allocations for the 1L flow, which is the first line allocation of treated patients to either product X or some other therapy in the first line. Here we use a dynamic share allocation to send patients to product X, and then for other first line therapies, we set that as the plug, meaning whatever we calculate as share going to product X, other 1L would be set so that the sum of all the shares sum to 100%. We can then select product X1L, edit the share allocation, and it opens up the window that we've just seen, which is for the template share allocation dynamic, where we can go in, change the peak share, change the conditionality on what development state is needed to be successful in order to get non-zero share, put in data exclusivity, patent expiration date, uptake and post-LOE retention schedules, and then optionally go in and overwrite those global assumptions for each individual segment, and also do things like introduce a segment-specific launch delay. The process of defining a model then becomes one of collecting a set of templates that collectively describe the market dynamics that we want to see. And we have an object called asset info within PPFC that's structured to accept these templates, stitch them together, and that's what PPFC uses in order to generate the model. So the process of developing these we can do either by writing the information that we need in the templates in a script. We could use a script to generate our overall assets with just dummy inputs and then go in and edit those to the template GUI, or we can use an asset builder to create this asset and model definition completely from scratch. So as you go in, you see you have a certain consistent structure. You have these global parameters for high-level model structure. Here we see part of that defines the reference information, the name of the asset, a short description that we're going to be printing on every GUI window, a longer description that the user can open for reference information, and then author citation. We also have development path information that we can drill down to and look at the assumptions we're making around each one of the stages of development. Here we see assumptions around a particular development stage where we set probability of technical success, duration in months, total cost in the currency that we define. And then we can go in and we can say, what are the prerequisites? What states have to be true or false in order for this stage to execute? And then what are the states whose success, in this case, success of phase 3, is determined by this uncertain outcome of the development stage when it executes. We have other assumptions like pricing policy and cost of goods sold for drugs that are going to span across multiple diseases. And again, we can set these in multiple different ways with different pricing policies, linear pricing, pricing per unit, pricing on an annual basis. We can grow them at a growth rate, grow them at a schedule of list price over calendar time, have certain, January and July have fixed price increases. We can do all sorts of different ways to price the individual drugs. And then finally, on each disease, we can open up a window to edit all the inputs that are specific to that disease. And again, you can drill down to get things like epidemiology. Here we see prevalence, where you have a base value as of a base date and grow that at a growth rate. Again, we have lots of different ways to do this. We can describe what the specific increase in the prevalent population is over time. And we have, for all the different other assumptions on preference share, flow structures, market access, promotional reach, we have templates to handle all the different elements that we may want to define. So in PPFC, where you end up saving a lot of the time is all you need to do is provide this description of the market dynamics. Again, that's going to be packaged in an instance of this PPFC class called asset info. So oftentimes you provide some sort of set of model inputs, use functionality to do type checks, make sure that we introduce, when it's a product share, that it has to be a number between 0 and 100%. And then we map those model inputs to the full set of market dynamics using templates, using specifications, either built-in ones or templates that we define ourselves. And we can also read in entire model libraries that are commonly used types of models that are all ready to go, where the only thing we have to do to apply it to a particular problem is just edit the model inputs. Everything else then is automated by PPFC. It takes this information about the definition of the asset model in an asset info class. It checks all the syntax that it creates, make sure it's consistent, make sure it's complete, tells you if it's not, raises warning messages. If it's okay, then it goes ahead and it creates the asset model itself. That's what implements a forecast and valuation model, outputting consistently structured results that are always uniform structure and can be aggregated across every PPFC model that you create. So it's very easy to have an entire franchise or enterprise model. We have all the different assets pulling from a collective set of common assumptions, run those in a common array, and then integrate the results. We can wrap these asset models inside of simulators that add additional functionality, bind scripts for execution, either from a library of built-in scripts to do common tasks, or to employ user-defined scripts that we can write that apply to any PPFC model to do the exactly kind of analyses that we want. And then those asset simulators and functionality can be wrapped again automatically inside of a graphical user interface to present to users. When we do that, we can also bind additional information that we want. So in this case, in a moment, we're going to see looking at a licensing deal. So we can use other parts of functionality, in this case PPFC deals, to describe the design of a deal in similar formats as we use to define the asset economics. And we can bind that to the asset model so that when we open the graphical user interface, in addition to all the forecasting and valuation and Monte Carlo type activities we do, we see that under the Run menu, we also have options to evaluate the deals that we've attached, design upfront milestone payments via logic that we provide, and all the deal simulation and deal economics are inherently linked to the reference asset so that we have a consistent view of the economics. So let's now look at a case example where the economics are particularly important because we're considering in-licensing an asset that's about ready to enter phase 3, here assumed in January 2026. And we want to value it and draft deal terms, and getting the economics right in this case are important because we're actually allocating real money up front through agreeing to pay an upfront, agreeing to pay milestone payments. And so we do need a quantitative estimate of the value of the asset, but we also need to make sure that we consider all the development risk and market uncertainty that could affect that value. For context, this asset product X is a weekly injectable to treat a chronic disease that has 200,000 prevalence in the US, growing at 1% annually. For simplicity, we're just going to look at the US, but we can do global forecasts, different currencies in different markets, have conversion factors integrated together. The entire purpose of PPFC is to be able to scale very readily to very large and complicated problems. When we enter phase 3 in January 2026, it's going to be with 2 parallel trials, each costing $35 million, lasting 4 years, and having a 70% chance of success. Here we're setting those as specific values. We could also, within PPFC, tie these into clinical trial simulations where we don't demonstrate that in this example. If both of those phase 3 trials succeed, we move to regulatory review that takes 1 year, costs $2 million, and has a 90% probability of success. In addition to our clinical development, we also are considering a head-to-head pipeline competitor that has a similar profile and launch timing, and it has a 50% chance of technical and regulatory success. We model a 90% diagnosis rate in this disease, with 75% of diagnosed patients being treated. For product X, we assume the preference share grows to 50% peak by 7 years after launch if we don't have a competitor. But if we do have a competitor, then the peak share is going to be reduced to 33%. We have 12 years of data exclusivity and patent protection through the end of 2042. And then after LOE, we lose brand share to biosimilars slowly over time, falling to 50% retention by 3 years and complete loss by 10 years. We also assume a 60% adherence to this weekly injection schedule. We're going to assume this product is going to be priced at $50,000 annually, growing at 2%. And then we have a 90% gross margin that we use to compute the COGS. We assume 60% of patients are covered by public payers, with a remainder of private payers, and we set access of public payers to 70% and of private payers to 80%. This is a haircut that's applied to the preference share to account for things like out-of-pocket costs and step edits, reimbursement restrictions. For the gross to net rebate and discount that's paid to payers, we assume 25% if there's no competitor. If there is a competitor, we need to discount more steeply and rebate in order to get formulary access, and so we assume that gross to net rate rises to 50%. For the commercial expenses, we assume that we're going to incur $50 million annually in incremental commercial costs to support this product, running from approval through 5 years after LOE, and we're going to have to spend another $50 million over the year after phase 3 success in order to build up capabilities. If the originator launches without licensing, we're going to model an alternative go-to-market scenario where we have the promotional reach falling to 60% and adding another $50 million to that upfront build of capabilities. And we do that so that we can get an idea for the other party in the deal what the best alternative to negotiated agreement is. The first step in defining the market dynamics to set the development pathway. In this case, it includes clinical development and the uncertain launch of a competitor, which is an event in market evolution. We start at phase 3 start, set that always equal to true as of January 2026, and then we have 2 parallel phase 3 trials, A and B, each one having a probability of success, total cost, and duration. The success or failure of each one of those stages, those trials, determines whether we successfully reach a state for phase 3A success or phase 3B success. And then if both of those are true, we declare overall phase 3 success through a stage that doesn't add any cost or risk. It just makes sure that we have to have both parallel trials correct and successful in order to declare success for the overall phase. If we have phase 3 success, then we move to regulatory review that again has a duration, cost, and risk. And if that's successful, we have approval. And that's a state that we make the product X share be conditional upon successfully achieving. We also model the market evolution through a competitor development stage that has no cost to us, lasts the same time because it's a head-to-head race, and has a 50% chance of approval of the competitor. If that's true, if that's successful, we get competitor launch, and depending on whether that state is true or false, we want to go back in and modify our assumptions around the peak preference share and the gross to net rate in order to match the competitive environment. Now this development path, once we define it and have the sequencing, have the conditionality, the time, and the cost, the development path figures out the stages and how long each one of these individual stages take that sets the date of approval. We use a similar graphical approach to describe the patient journey. In this case, we have a simple prevalence model of diagnosis, a decision to treat, and first-line allocation of product X. In PPFC, we keep track of patient populations in each stock by month. We start with prevalent patients with the assumed initial prevalence value and a growth rate in that. Then we have a flow DX, which moves prevalent patients into diagnosed at a 90% diagnosis rate. We have a flow TX that moves 75% of diagnosed patients into treated. And we have then a flow 1L for first-line allocation that we use this dynamic peak share that grows to 50% if without a competitor, 33% with a competitor, and has the assumptions that we make about uptake, market exclusivity, and loss of share after exclusivity. We also then layer on access assumptions by payer for public payer and private payer, and then add a multiplier for promotional reach, which acts like access as a haircut on preference share based on the amount of marketing and sales support. We're going to set that to 100% for our base case, but then in this alternative go-to-market scenario, we're going to reduce it to 60% if the originator does not out-license. Once we calculate the patient populations in each stock as a function of time, we can look at the patients in product X1L when we declare that to be a drug-consuming stock and calculate then based on the scheduled number of injections per month and the adherence rate, what's the monthly units of drug that are consumed. Multiply that by the list price at that time, which itself is going to be growing in order to get monthly gross revenues, apply to gross to net rate to get net revenues, and then subtract all the other costs that we calculate, cost of goods sold, selling, general administrative, other marketing costs, and the development costs in order to get earnings before interest and taxes and net present value. By default, we work on a pre-tax basis, but we can layer into our model specific tax treatment if we want to calculate after-tax values. In addition to the asset model inputs, we also define a licensing deal with the term framework that we can go in and modify later by changing upfront and milestone payments and the base rate of the royalty. In this type of licensing deal, we define a scope of the diseases, segments, and drugs whose sales are covered. In this case, we're just looking at the US in the chronic disease for this one drug, so we're going to cover everything under the scope of the licensing deal. We can say that the buyer assumes a particular share of the development costs, makes a fixed payment as an upfront when deal execution occurs. Then we can add optional phase 3 success and approval milestones that are made if and when those development stages are successfully reached. We can add commercial milestones. Here we're going to add one that's going to be paid out annually after a year in which net revenues exceed $1 billion. We can define multiple milestones with any number of definitions about how those are derived. We have a royalty base rate, which is a fraction of net revenues paid to the originator, to the seller of the asset. And then we define a tier structure. In this case, we do it as a schedule at which royalties are paid as a percent of the base rate on tranches of net revenue that are defined relative to the estimated peak net revenues. And we start out at the base rate, but we decline that as we get into higher tranches of revenue so that the seller originator essentially is paid out early, and it continues to incentivize the buyer of the asset in order to drive incremental sales above what might be initially estimated and incentivize them because they retain the bulk of the benefit when they drive those incremental sales. So we take all those assumptions around the asset economics, package those into a PPFC classes asset info. We have elements of PPFC deals that we use to describe this licensing deal. And by the way, we have a standard deal here, but we can describe deals that have arbitrarily complex terms in them and model those as well. And automatically then PPFC does everything else. It creates a forecast model for us, links the deal to the asset, and presents us a set of Windows options or menu options that allow us to go run and do different things. We're going to start using the model by analyzing the base case. When we launch the model, we can optionally tell it to automatically dump all of the forecast results into Excel that it stores in a working directory. And then we can go back in under the base case and choose individual views of patients, drug units, gross and net revenues, costs, and the entire P&L at different frequencies for different parts of the problem. And then we can either drill down and look at a very detailed breakup or roll up the inputs across all different diseases, segments, drugs, etc. So we have a standard way in order to go in and look at these views. And so we can calculate a view that we look at total patients on product X as a function of time on an annual basis, and we see that it grows, has a near uniform peak, and then after LOE, here we model a very slow decline post-LOE share retention over time. Now, in addition to calculating all these outputs, we can also use explore variables to go in and open a window where we can drill in and see in every disease and segment of disease, what are all the variables that we either define as inputs or derive and calculate in our templates. And again, they have unique names that are descriptive so we can see which it is. And we can drill in and see the values. Here we're seeing what's the peak preference share, and we report the value at 33%. When we have curves or time variables, we can plot those over time as well. And so we have complete visibility into everything that's calculated in the model, and then through the syntax, the logic by which the model is being operated. The standard inputs that are always calculated, as we see here, are patients, drug units, gross revenues, net revenues, costs, and then the pre-tax P&L, earnings before interest and taxes, and pre-tax NPV. Here we see it for the base case, and we specify when we build the model, in this case, that we want to use units of thousands when we're looking at patients and drug units, and units of millions of our currency when we're looking at any financials like revenues or costs. Now, the base case assumes all the inputs that are derived in when we initially create the model, and it also assumes that all the development states and stages of success. So that means in that base case, we have a competitor. We can go in and calculate a named scenario that we're going to call no competitor by going under calculate forecast and then deselecting competitor launch so that we don't successfully reach that development state. That means we now no longer have a competitor. We give it the name and then calculate the forecast, and we get the same window that opens up that allows us to go in, view the different results, save views to Excel, do anything we want to do. In this case, we see when we do a patient view that now the peak number of patients on our drug grows from 40,000 to 60,000, which is in line with the ratio of peak shares that occurs when we no longer have a competitor, growing from 33% to 50%. This forecast is linked to the development outcomes, so we can also consider different situations where we no longer have clinical development success but fail at some stage along the way. So here we're going to do the same procedure with calculate forecast, and now we're going to leave the competitor in but deselect approval. So we're assuming that we have successful phase 3, we move into regulatory review, we have this at-risk building of commercial capabilities because phase 3 was successful, but now the regulatory review fails and we're no longer approved. We're going to name this a fail review forecast, and again calculate forecast, and we see as we expect that we don't have any patients, consumption of drug units, gross and net revenues, but we do have costs. We have the cost of the clinical development, we have the cost to build commercial capabilities that's triggered by phase 3 success, and we have the cost of the review. As a result, the value in this situation is quite poor at negative 93 million because we spend a lot of money, but we don't have any benefit from sales of the drug. Since we can calculate a forecast in a specific development outcome, we can move under the run menu to value of a development uncertainty to calculate what the expected value is averaged over all the different possible random outcomes consistent with partial specifications that we supply. So here, as we see when we open up that menu and we move down to development states, we're going to say that phase 3 start is a success, and all the different clinical trials, phase 3A, phase 3B is success. That means phase 3 overall is a success and approval is success, but we leave unspecified whether a competitor launches or not. We now calculate net present value, And what it does is it runs a Monte Carlo simulation over every possible random outcome, giving each outcome a unique name that's given by the highest development state that's successfully reached, and it adds a 1 or 2, etc. if there's multiple of those. Here we've reached approval, but we have 2 different outcomes, one with a competitor and one without, each 50% likely. We then value the asset in each one of those different unique outcomes and average all those values over the distribution of outcomes to get the overall expected EBIT and expected net present value of the asset. We can use that same approach now over all clinical and competitor uncertainty by going back to the same value of development uncertainty menu and now leaving everything unspecified except the fact that we start with phase 3. Now when we do Monte Carlo simulation, we have a large number of different possible outcomes where we essentially progress clinically to different stages, and for each one of those clinical progression stage have 2 different equally likely, in this case, outcomes, one with a competitor and one without. And if we look at the 2 approval outcomes now, we see that they sum to 44%, which is what we'd expect from probability of technical and regulatory success with 2 parallel trials, each with a 70% chance of technical success and a 90% chance of regulatory success in the review. When we now calculate the expected net present value averaged over all this uncertainty, we have a value of about $1.4 billion as of the time that we're beginning phase 3. We can now do that same valuation over all the development and commercial competitor uncertainty by selecting the go alone scenario instead of the base scenario. And what that's going to do is impose these changes where we now reduce the promotional reach to 60%, and we have now an increased amount of the upfront capability spend if phase 3 is success. When we do this simulation, we get the same distribution over development outcomes because that hasn't changed. But now when we look at the expected net present value, we find that it falls from about 1.4 billion to 750 million because of this reduction in sales from the limited promotional reach and this additional cost. And that big gap here from synergy tells us there's a very significant range in which we can do a deal on licensing that makes sense to both parties. And when we calculate forecasts, we've seen that we can do it by changing different development outcomes. We can also go in and calculate new forecasts by editing individual inputs. In this case, we're going to calculate forecast, and we're going to change the annual price of our drug from $50,000 to $60,000, and we're going to give that a new named forecast called price 60K. To make the change, we go to edit model inputs, and that opens up a general utility to edit these inputs where we can select commercial, select pricing, select base annual price to drill down to what we want to change, open up the window, change that value to 60,000, and then go through exit and save edits to return out of those editor windows. And then if we want to see before we run the forecast what changes are made to all the static variables and dates and other assumptions within the model, we can look at view current edits, and we see that what we've done is we've changed the values of a static variable for the base unit price and for the unit COGS of the drug based on this new price. Then everything else that changes, all these time variables that describe price over time, everything else that references these static variables by name, then change automatically when we do the forecast. Now when we run the model, in addition to calculating a base case, if we defined any scenarios, it automatically also calculates forecasts for those. As we mentioned, we have an alternative scenario that we define for a go-alone basis. We also define when we build this model a low and a high scenario that are defined based on bounds in key inputs like price and prevalence based on certain uncertainties. Roughly here we're saying 10% uncertainty in each one. Now we can go in and we can look at the individual forecasts for each one of those assets, but we can also use those scenarios in order to do things like sensitivity analysis, where we go in and we change the 2 inputs that change in these scenarios, base price and prevalence, and see what's the individual effect as we move from the base case to the low or the high case on a metric here, peak net revenues, as we make those changes. And we can do waterfall charts where we move from one scenario to the next here from low to high, and we look at what's the cumulative effect of the changes in inputs that we make on the bridge of how, in this case, peak net revenues change. We can also use these scenarios, in this case a low and high scenario, that are defining bounds on input uncertainty in order to run Monte Carlo simulation. We choose Run Monte Carlo from Scenarios. That opens up a window where we say we want the midpoint of the input distributions to be at the base, and we want to use the low and the high for the bounds. We optionally select which development states are success or failure, and then when we run Monte Carlo, we see plots, and we can save to Excel outputs of the revenues and patient counts and drug unit volumes and EBIT over the uncertainty that's created by varying these inputs at random. We see a horizontal line for the median, vertical bars that go from the 25th to 75th percentile, and outliers and extreme values are calculated with circles, points. What we've done till now is look at the forecast and valuation of the asset. Now we want to go into these functionality that we've attached to the model to evaluate our deal. So we go into Run Evaluate Deals. We can have multiple different types of deal designs linked to the same model. Here we have a single one that we call Out License at Phase 3. We want to evaluate that deal for the base case forecast, and so we select that, and then when we evaluate for the selected forecast, we see a view into the economics that first looks at the overall NPV of the asset for the scope of the deal. Here it's the overall asset, but if we had a licensing deal just for the EU, we'd be looking at the value specifically for the EU. We have the scoped costs, again, that come under the context of the deal. So if we had a global asset and we had an EU licensing, we'd only include EU costs in the output. In the payments, we calculate under this case what's the payments made for each year over the terms of the deal, here with upfront payments, sharing of development costs, a single approval milestone, and royalty payments. And then we calculate the value and the net present value to the seller and to the buyer under the terms of the deal. For the buyer, this is going to be all the revenues that are gained and all the commercial costs that are incurred, less the amount of development costs that they've agreed to assume and the payments that they make in terms of milestones, upfronts, and royalties to the seller. The seller, their costs are the development costs that they continue to support themselves that they haven't shared to the buyer, and then the payments that they receive under the terms of the deal for development milestones, royalties, etc. These deals are tied to forecasts. Those forecasts are linked to development outcomes. So we can do the same task where we look at different development outcomes and we see how that affects the economics of the deal. Here we go, and we now evaluate the economics of the deal for the fail review forecast, which again assumes success in terms of phase 3, but we fail the regulatory review. And we now calculate the economics. We see that we have a negative value for the asset. The buyer assumes a lot of costs and is quite poor in NPV because they have to make the upfront payment, they share a fraction of the development costs, and then they end up having that at-risk bolus of investment to build out commercial capabilities when phase 3 succeeds, but because the review fails, they never get any revenues from it. For the seller or the originator, it looks very different. They still have some share of the development costs, but now they have the upfront payment and at least some value of offsetting a share that the buyer assumes, and so in this case, they actually realize a slightly positive NPV. We now do the same thing that we did for the asset, which is we evaluate the deal over development uncertainty using just the default design parameters that we put in before we try to do any adjustments. So now under Evaluate Licensing Deal, we choose Evaluate Deal over Development Uncertainty, and we can specify in this case, again, completely unspecified whether we have a competitor that launch or whether we have success of any of the clinical development. And so we see the same distribution of development outcomes. We value the asset under the scope of the deal in each one of those outcomes. And then for each outcome, we separately calculate what are the payments that are made under the terms of the deal and what's the value to the buyer and to the seller. And then we aggregate all that information into the chart that we see at left in the box at bottom right, which has in blue the NPV to the buyer and in orange the NPV to the seller over each one of these individual outcomes, and then it averages over all of those outcomes to get an overall expected NPV to the buyer under the deal and to the seller. We also show here a breakdown that if you have all developments succeeding, what's the contribution to the payment NPV by each individual term. So we see that we have the biggest component being from royalties, but then we also have approval, upfront, and development cost also contributing significantly to the payment NPV. Now in this case, we see that if we have this 1.4 billion expected value, the expected value to the buyer is 1.3 and 100 million to the seller. So we have a very unbalanced deal design when we just threw in default assumptions in here. This is not a deal that the originator would accept. So we want to go through a design process, an optimization process to try to get something that's closer to a mutually acceptable deal. In order to design the upfront and development milestone payments, we're going to use our own algorithm that we're going to define and implement in a very short method that we bind to this model that uses a functionality of PPFC to do all the expected net present value calculations and operates then on any model once we define the logic. We start at the initial point when the deal is executed, which assumes occurs roughly when the asset is entering phase 3. We've already calculated the expected value at that stage is $1.4 billion. We calculate the upfront payment at that time by saying what fraction of that expected net present value at start do we expect the seller to capture through the deal, and we subtract then the net present value that the buyer is already committed to by taking a share of the development costs, and then we say we're going to pay out some fraction of that incremental value at upfront. As we advance the asset through the clinical development pathway and we go from phase 3 start to phase 3 success, the expected value grows significantly from 1.4 to 4.4 billion from a number of factors. First, the probability of technical and regulatory success increases because we no longer have the risk of the phase 3 trial. The costs of those phase 3 trials are now in the past and sunk, so they're not a detriment to valuing the asset. And all those future sales are now much closer to being realized and so go up in expected value. When we then move further and achieve approval, we see a much smaller increase that's due to the same kind of contributions. We now have completely eliminated clinical development risk. All the prior costs of the review are now sunk and of building the development capabilities at that time. And the future sales now are again even closer to being realized. At each one of the milestones, if we choose to include a milestone in our deal terms, we see how much has the expected net present value changed since the last time we made a payment, and we do the same kind of logic of having a fraction captured by the seller and a fractional payout in order to set those development milestones. When we now run this method under our model by choosing run, set, deal, upfront, and milestones, we get a number of pop-up windows where it asks us, first of all, to specify the target capture of value by the seller under the deal. We set that at 50%. The target payout ratio or fraction at the upfront, we set that also to 50%. We set the fraction of the incremental value paid out at each milestone. We set that to 25%. And then we choose that we're not going to include in our deal a milestone at phase 3, but we are going to include one at approval. After we input that information, the procedure that we defined then goes through, calculates what the upfront payment and milestones are. With that, writes the report to a text file, opens that up for the viewer to see, and opens up the same window that we've seen before in order to now see how the deal economics have changed after we've changed this deal upfront and milestone. If we go to edit deal parameters, we open a window where now when we go through and we see the upfront payment, the milestones, we see that it has the new values that we've calculated. And when we now evaluate the deal over development uncertainty, we see that we get closer to an even split, about $900 million in expected value for the buyer, about $500 million for the seller. So it's a little bit more even, but it still appears that it underweights the value that goes to the seller. To reach a more balanced split of value, we can increase the commercial milestone to $50 million and raise the base royalty rate to 20%. We do that through edit deal parameters. And then when we save those edits and run again, evaluate over development uncertainty, we find that now the buyer gets 52% of expected net present value. The seller realizes the remaining 48%. And that's a seller expected net present value that's under the value if they launch the asset themselves. However, they're now significantly de-risked through the upfront payment and the sharing of development costs, so it still can be a mutually acceptable deal. Now we could continue to tune these. We could call a built-in deal optimizer in PPFC to maximize an objective function by changing the deal terms. In practice, these deal terms are going to be set by negotiation. So as we continue to propose and counter-propose terms, we can update those in our deal term model, see what the implications are to the economics of either party as we hopefully converge to a mutually acceptable set of terms. Here we've had an add-on routine in order to evaluate a licensing deal that's attached, but we can choose many different built-in or bespoke add-on methodologies and routines and functionality that we add to the models in PPFC when it creates it. Here we use another built-in version that we can decide to choose, which runs Monte Carlo simulation over both development and input uncertainty. And we do that by selecting under the Run menu, Run Calculate Expected Net Present Value over development and input uncertainty. That opens up another window where in this case we're going to say we're going to start with the base case. Let's keep in there all the uncertainty we have in no specification of the development outcomes other than we start phase 3. And we're going to use our low and high scenarios that we define to define bounds on inputs based on uncertainty. We also have an option here to go in and select certain defined other sets of Monte Carlo parameters where we make arbitrary changes to static variables and dates. It could be correlated, could be derived however we want. And when we now evaluate the expected net present value, we get the same outcome distribution of the development outcomes, but now in each one of the states that we've defined when we do this where it matters with approval in order to do Monte Carlo over input uncertainty, we also for those two approval states make random changes to the parameters by looking at different values of list price, different values of prevalence, seeing what the distribution of that is, and now when we calculate net present value, it's an average over all forms of uncertainty. We also, again, report the results of this so we can see in detail what's the whole range of values that we see as we combine all of the different parts of uncertainty together. In this case, it changes very little the overall expected net present value because our low and high cases are defined symmetrically around the base case. It doesn't really matter. So when we go and we do deals, we could go and we could evaluate them over all forms of uncertainty, but here it's sufficient to really only look at development uncertainty because we have these symmetric input uncertainties. So to conclude, we've looked at a case example that, while synthetic, reflects common situations we find when making R&D decisions and business development decisions in which we need to value assets and look at the economics of deals. With just a short kind of script or putting together a bunch of templates, we've generated a very powerful and flexible forecasting and valuation model linked it to a licensing deal. And we've done it in a way that this script and the model that we create is easily reused and adapted for different problems. That's another key form of the advantage. It's much easier to do these rapid analyses if you've already done a model or have it available in a library, something that's similar. We've done all the different kind of analysis over uncertainty in clinical development, market evolution, commercial inputs, and these methods scale well to complicated markets. And that's important because increasingly the kinds of assets and deals that we're looking at are exposed to all these diverse types of different risks and uncertainties. Here we just have a simple development program, but we can also model alternative R&D strategies or different lifecycle management strategies through adding decision variables in our decision path that lock or unlock different pathways. We can also then look at, for an individual trial, what happens individually based on whether we have, a minimally acceptable clinical profile, base profile, optimistic profile, and we can do all that kinds of uncertainty over the clinical outcome where we link that to forecast parameters, for example, through primary research and looking at share allocation models. The result of this then is a flexible and powerful framework for doing very rapid, user-friendly economic analyses and doing it in a way that provides to users consistent views, look and feel of the model, ways of operating it, and allowing these models to be integrated together to give higher level views of a franchise or enterprise. With that, I'd like to conclude. If you have further questions, you can contact me at kbeers@bachforlifesciences.com. We also have presented on that website different use cases that show different aspects of the PPFC functionality. Thank you.